An orphan source is a rather dramatic way of describing a self-contained radioactive source that is no longer under regulatory control. There's a lot of things that we use, tools, like, for example, medical equipment, that have radioactive substances in them. These substances are included as part of the build in these machines, or whatever they may be, and are designed in such a way so as to not, irradiate anybody. But on occasion, such sources, wherever they originate, are lost or misplaced. It's something to be avoided for very obvious reasons, but on occasion it has happened, and in some instances have led to significantly horrific consequences. Likely the worst case of this happening was known as the Goiânia accident, which occurred in September of 1987 in Goiânia, Goiás, Brazil, and the Orphan in question was a tiny capsule containing just 93 grams of something called caesium chloride. Now, caesium chloride is an inorganic compound that is really just a colorless type of salt, and it has multiple different applications. However, this particular caesium chloride also contained caesium-137, sometimes called radiocaesium, and that is a radioactive isotope of caesium, one of the more common fission products that results during a fission reaction of uranium-235. Now, caesium-137 on its own is hilariously radioactive, but it does have practical uses. The isotope's half-life is roughly 30 years, and if you were to stand 1 meter from the source, you'd receive a pretty decent dose of ionizing radiation, roughly 4.56 grays an hour. That is not an inconsequential amount of radiation, but caesium-137 is utilized in some medical equipment, for example. This particular caesium-137 capsule was used in a radiotherapy machine that had been purchased back in 1977 and utilized at the Instituto Goiano de Radioterapia, or IGR, which was a private radiotherapy institute located in Goiânia, less than a mile away from the administrative center of the city. But IGR moved their premises in 1985, and left behind that particular radiotherapy machine in the old building. The exact serial number of the device is still unknown, but it's believed to be a US build. And again, it was used for radiation therapy, generally as a part of cancer treatment. So the caesium-137 was being used productively, trying to help people beat cancer. But, naturally, with anything radioactive, if it were to be, say, misplaced, or in this case stolen, that could lead to some serious, dire consequences. It was safely contained in the machine in a canister made of lead and steel, so it wasn't in danger of radiating anything in that building, had it simply been left alone. But the exact fate of that abandoned site that I mentioned was still being disputed in court between the IGR and the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, who actually owned the building. And it was known that IGR had left behind some equipment, and some of that equipment had radioactive material. Just a few months prior to the incident, Sara Tenaguti, who was the director of ISPAGO, the Institute of Insurance for Civil Servants, got the police involved because one of the owners of IGR, who knew that radiation-based devices were still in the building, named Carlos Figueiredo Bezerril, was trying to remove some of the radioactive material that had been left behind. He knew it was there and knew that it shouldn't be there, like it wasn't really secure. Carlos tried to warn the president of ISPAGO about this, but nothing was done due to all the legal matters. The only thing that really happened was that the Court of Goiás did post a single security guard protecting the site, while all the background nonsense went on. The owners of IGR would also write multiple letters to the National Nuclear Energy Commission, warning them about the dangers of the equipment that had been left in the abandoned site, but they weren't permitted to remove it because of a court order in place, so it was simply left. On September 13th, 1987, the guard employed to protect the site just didn't show up for work. He was like, I don't feel like going to work today. Maybe he had a cold, I don't know. But that meant that no one was there guarding the site, and anyone could just waltz in. Just like, hey, look at all this stuff. I wonder if anything's possibly dangerous, or, in their case, worth money. Roberto dos Santos Alves and Wagner Mota Piera would trespass on to the site looking for anything of value. And I suppose, technically speaking, a lot of the equipment would have been somewhat valuable to the right person, but instead of taking it out all at once, they partially disassembled the radiotherapy unit and found the source, which looked like it might be valuable. Oh, what is it? I don't know. Maybe we'll be able to sell it, make some cash. They took the source in a wheelbarrow back to Roberto's home and planned to sell it for scrap. And again, it was self-contained, shielded by lead, so had they simply left it alone, probably would have been fine, but instead they proceeded to disassemble it further, removing much of the shielding, and the evening after they did this, they both began to vomit excessively because they had been irradiated. But at the time, these two chuckleheads didn't put together that, hey, maybe this thing might actually be dangerous. They thought they were just sick or something, maybe they caught a bug. It happens. It didn't matter that Piera's left hand began to swell like crazy and develop a burn that was about the same size and shape as the thing they had just taken apart. I'm sure that wasn't a clue. He wound up having to have several of his fingers partially amputated as a result of this. On the 15th, Piera would visit a local clinic who didn't even consider that radiation might be a factor because, well, they didn't know what they had done. The doctor's first thought with the vomiting and diarrhea they were experiencing was simply a foodborne illness, food poisoning, and he was simply told to go home and get some rest. Roberto, despite being sick, continued dismantling the equipment and eventually freed the caesium capsule from its protective rotating head. He would have severe exposure as a direct result of this, and his right forearm would later become ulcerated, requiring amputation on October 14th. But prior to all that happening, on the 16th, Roberto would puncture the capsule's aperture window with a friggin' screwdriver. Why are screwdrivers always involved in radiation disasters? Like, people keep wanting me to talk about the Demon Core. That's a different story. That was also because some dude was messing around with a screwdriver. Stop using screwdrivers near nuclear stuff! But because he had punctured the window, he was able to see a deep blue glow coming from inside the capsule. He would insert the screwdriver and manage to scoop out some of this mysterious glowing stuff. He wasn't sure what it was, but it looked magical. And certainly wasn't actively killing him at that moment. He thought maybe it was a special type of gunpowder. Why his brain went to gunpowder when he had to know the building he had looted was a medical facility, I'm not sure. But he tried to light it, and it didn't combust, which, yeah, caesium-137 wouldn't do that. But, yeah, you should probably get rid of that, my guy. Regardless, he thought it was valuable because shiny, and on September 18th, he was able to sell everything to a nearby scrapyard. The owner of the scrapyard, Dever Alves Ferreira, would eventually notice that blue glow thing coming from the punctured capsule that his scrapyard had just bought. He had no idea what it was, and had no way of knowing. There were no clues for him. He didn't know the scrap was stolen or where it was even from, but he figured that since it was glowing and shiny, it must be valuable, or maybe even magic. Magic dust! Glowing dust of magicalness! Hooray! And then he brought it home to show his family. Dever! No! Indeed, over the following days, he invited friends and other family members to see the glowing powder, because it was cool. And yeah, it probably looked pretty cool. On the 21st, back at the scrapyard, one of Dever's friends would get some more of the rice-sized grains of the glowing stuff out of the capsule using a screwdriver. Seriously, guys, stop it. Because there was enough of the stuff to share around, Dever wasn't looking to profit. He decided to share this cool thing with a bunch of friends and family. He gave it for free to a bunch of people as gifts. He was trying to be nice. But that same day, his wife, 37-year-old Maria fell ill. On the 25th, DeVere would sell the scrap metal to another scrapyard, though the powder had already gone all over the place. The previous day, the 24th, Ivo, who was DeVere's brother, managed to get some additional dust out of the source and took it to his house. He decided to spread it all over his concrete floor, because it looked shiny and cool, like, yeah, look at this, it's all glowy and stuff, guys. And his 6-year-old daughter, Lady das Neves Ferreira, later ate some food while she was sitting on that floor. She thought the glowing stuff was cool, spreading it over her face like glitter as an accessory, showing it off to her mom. Oh my god. Lydie would get very, very, very sick. She received about 6 grays, which was a fatal dose. Her mother, Lourdes, would also get seriously ill from the radiation. But back over at DeVere's household, Maria was the first one to notice that, ever since you brought home that mysterious glowing stuff, hun, everyone's getting sick. You think there might be a connection? She decided later on the September 28th to take the initiative, believing that something was seriously wrong here, and retrieved the materials from the rival scrapyard, as well as all the powder and stuff that she had, and took them to a nearby hospital, who happened to have a visiting medical physicist. That physicist used a scintillation counter to discover that, oh no! They immediately contacted the authorities, assuring them that this was no drill and that they might have a serious radiological contamination incident on their hands. The city, state, and national officials were all aware of the incident by the end of the 29th. Indeed, because DeVere had given so much away, the stuff got everywhere, though at first they weren't sure how bad it really was. News of the radiation incident was broadcast on pretty much all the news channels, and within a few days, nearly 130,000 people who all lived in Goiânia rushed to the local hospitals, worrying that they might be irradiated. Fortunately, most of those people were absolutely fine. Of the 130,000, 249 were contaminated, which is still a lot, but not nearly as many as was feared. Of the 249, 20 people showed signs of radiation sickness and did require treatment, and as a result of all this, there were a total of 4 fatalities. Admilson Alves de Souza, who was just 18 years old, received 5.3 grays. He was an employee of DeVere's and had worked directly on the source. The radiation would cause him lung damage, internal bleeding, heart damage, and he would die on October 28, 1987. Maria Gabriela Ferreira, the wife of DeVere, who had been the one to turn the material over to the authorities and alert everyone, remember, was sadly too exposed to survive. She received 5.7 grays in total, and had been sick since about 3 days after coming into contact with the caesium. Her condition got much worse, developing secondary signs of radiation poisoning like hair loss, and she suffered from internal bleeding in her limbs, eyes, and digestive tract. She deteriorated into mental confusion and acute renal insufficiency before she also died on October 23rd, 1987. Israel Batista dos Santos, who was 22 years old, received 4.5 grays, and he was also an employee of DeVere's, who had worked on the source. He got serious respiratory and lymphatic complications and died on October 27th, 1987. And poor Lydie das Neves Ferreira, age 6 years old, received 6 grays. The niece of DeVere and Maria, she died the same day as Maria, October 23rd, 1987. She was confined to an isolated room at the hospital because the staff were afraid to go near her. She was so sick and so contaminated. She experienced serious swelling in her upper body, hair loss, kidney and lung damage, internal bleeding, before finally passing away. She was buried in a common cemetery in Goiânia, in a special fiberglass coffin lined with lead so her remains wouldn't cause any contamination. They took appropriate measures here, but because of the panic surrounding the event, news of her burial caused a riot of 2,000 people showing up to the cemetery as a 6-year-old girl was being buried because they thought that her body would poison the surrounding land. They tried to prevent her from being buried using stones and bricks blocking the cemetery roadway, but despite these interferences, she was safely buried, laid to rest as was proper. It's hard to blame the people, though, because the fear surrounding this came out of ignorance, as did the entire event. The only ones with any real clue as to the source of this stuff were the thieves, remember. DeVere's scrapyard had gotten a hold of it and didn't know where it was from. He just thought it was funny glowing stuff. And it was, but it was also incredibly dangerous. But this assumption that it was safe came out of ignorance, not apathy. He didn't mean to hurt anybody, let alone his wife and niece, or his employees. DeVere himself received an astonishing 7 grays of radiation, which could have killed him, but he somehow pulled through. At least, when it came to the radiation. See, the guilt surrounding everything never left him. It wasn't his fault. You don't know what you don't know, and he didn't know. Again, he didn't mean to hurt anybody. He was trying to be nice. He thought he was sharing this awesome, cool thing with his family and friends, and wound up killing those closest to him. The weight on his conscience never left him, and he began to drink a lot. He would die in 1994 of cirrhosis of the liver, effectively taking his own life not with a gun, but with a bottle. In terms of lingering consequences from the accident, well, to begin with, the cleanup was actually handled very well. The authorities took it very seriously and did their best to make everything safe. And did. Goiânia is no longer dangerous, and only a small part of the overall city was contaminated. And even then, you probably wouldn't get a lethal dose unless you actually got close to the powder, which they managed to collect. Though it was difficult to prove that it was all taken care of because it was water-soluble. Fortunately, it never seems to have gotten into any major water sources, though for many years afterwards, much of the surrounding region started thinking everyone who lived in Goiânia was irradiated and it was dangerous to go there. Over the years, that has somewhat stopped, and all this was mostly to do with simple ignorance again. They just didn't know it was dangerous. In terms of legal consequences, well, in addition to a civil action, legal proceedings were also brought against the Federal Union, the National Nuclear Energy Commission, the state of Goiás, the Social Security Institute for Civil Servants, the 4 medical doctors who owned IGR, and the clinic's physicist. The matter wouldn't be really settled until the year 2000, when the defendants were ordered to pay compensation of $1.3 million to the Defense of the Diffuse Rights Fund, a federal fund for the compensation of damage to the environment, consumers' property, and rights of artistic, historic, and cultural value, and other collective rights. It's a lot. In that sentence, though, he excluded the state of Goiás and the Federal Union from paying anything. The National Nuclear Energy Commission had to pay $1 million on their own, and the Social Security Institute for Civil Servants had to pay a fine of $100,000, plus interest, as of September 13th, 1987. The court didn't declare the owners of IGR liable for the whole thing, because remember, they had also known it was there and were trying to get it out, though one of them was fined $100,000, and the clinic's physicist was fined another $100,000 because he was responsible for the control of the medical manipulation of the radiological device. And what about the 2 thieves? Right? They had stolen the thing, right? It seems like they should be, punished somehow. And, well, they weren't included as defendants in the public civil suit, but the court did find them directly responsible for the accident because they had stolen the thing. If they had been arraigned as defendants, they probably would have gotten a conviction. But the problem with doing that is that they couldn't prove criminal intent in this case. Because they could prove they had stolen it, because they did, which was a crime on its own, but they didn't know how dangerous it actually was. They didn't know what it was either. They didn't mean to cause a radiological disaster. These guys weren't crazed terrorists or something. They were just petty criminals. They certainly didn't mean to kill anybody. And there were no warning signs on the abandoned building or even on the device itself to tell them, hey guys, really don't touch this. So they weren't really punished in terms of the disaster. It's a tremendously sad story, all things considered. And there indeed have been other orphan source incidents, though none of them were quite this bad, fortunately. Generally, an orphan source only results in contamination of 1 or maybe 2 people. This was over 200, which is about as bad as that generally gets, and hopefully, nothing will ever come close to this again. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a farewell.